Welcome to the Contrarians, and tonight we have a great topic. The topic, why is no one talking Motörhead? Well, we're going to change all that tonight. The panel's here. We are ready. Let's get started.
Another, I believe, Patreon-suggested topic with the rather ambiguous title of Why is Nobody Talking About Motörhead? Are People Afraid to Talk About Motörhead? And I want to point out that after we voted on that, but before we recorded this episode, Sea of Tranquility did a show about Motörhead. So I'm suggesting that we spontaneously change the title to Even though other people are in fact talking about Motörhead, we're going to talk about Motörhead anyway, doggone it, because you can't stop us. We'll pizzazz it up a little bit in post. So we're just going to go around and talk about Motörhead, I guess. And since we're starting off nebulous, Martin, why don't you tell us what you would like to say about Motörhead? And let's just see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I don't particularly want to talk about Motörhead, but I like the question, why is nobody talking about Motörhead? But, first we have to think about, is it true? I mean, do people not talk about Motörhead a lot? And I got thinking about it a little bit, and it's like, well, whether it's true or not, I don't know. I mean, I don't see it a lot, but I can think of some reasons why it's difficult to talk about Motörhead. You guys all know that I actually did a Motörhead book that's literally about the early days lineup. So this ends at Iron Fist. But the crazy thing about this book, and it relates, is the idea that when I started this book, all three of them were alive. And I believe how it works is by the time it came out, all three of them were dead. So one of the reasons we don't talk about Motörhead is that the old Motörhead isn't talking anymore. So that's kind of an interesting thing. It's like when these bands die off, they no longer have a voice. So we're not getting Lemmy interviews anymore. So you're not getting that two-way conversation anymore, at least with the classic lineup of where, everybody, that the albums that are celebrated a lot. And so, yeah, those guys aren't around to talk about them anymore. Another funny reason I thought it's more of like, why doesn't anybody like to type about Motörhead? It's because you have to look up the umlaut all the time. You have to stop and go to symbol and drag down and grab that umlaut and put it in place, right? And the next time it comes up again. So nobody likes to type the word Motörhead. Just the same way they don't like to type Blue Oyster Cult or Wasp with the uppercase period, lowercase. I have to look up REM today, because I've looked up REM like 10 times in my life or more. It's like, does it have the damn dots or not? Okay, I guess it does, right? So there's that. But the more serious reason, and I'll so I don't hog the mic, I'll just bring it up and you guys can run with it. I think there's the idea a little bit of that they have so many albums and so many great albums, and they come out all the time. And there's a kind of uniformity to Motörhead's sound that everybody's intimidated about trying to pick out which of those albums they like the best. It's a lot of work trying to figure that out. And I wrote a big, a bunch of this Motörhead special issue for Revolver, and I had to go through and make some of these rankings and stuff, and it's pretty difficult because you start feeling very frustrated that it's all really good. I don't know what reason I have to rate this album higher than that album or this song higher than that, but I'll leave that because I think that's the most important point here. It's a little bit like, it's not exactly like Dream Theater, but we always joke that it's really hard to talk about Dream Theater because you're intimidated. But it's a little different with Motörhead, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, I personally love the fact that we are comparing Motörhead with Dream Theater in any capacity. Because I love Motörhead and I'm not a Dream Theater fan. So take that, prog rockers. All right, I'm just going to go around the screen the way I've got it listed. And that means Kevin is up next. Kevin, why don't people talk about Motörhead, man?
Good question. And I had some of the same questions that Martin had. I mean, is it true? I think in our kind of nerdy music circles, we do talk about Motörhead quite a bit, but they never really caught on the mainstream. And I always looked at them as sort of a super cult band. You know, they're highly influential to a lot of big bands that we know, and we'll freely talk about them. You know, just ask the guys in Metallica. But for whatever reason, they never caught on to the mainstream. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think we can point out. I think Martin pointed out correctly, you know, the just the massive catalog, and it's also extremely consistent. Where do you start if you become a new Motörhead fan? You know, and the sound changes. I love the latter period Motörhead, but it doesn't sound, at least production wise, like early Motörhead, even though those early albums are classics for a reason. They set a lot of trends in a way in the late 70s, early 80s. Another thing I thought about was they were always sort of there, depending on what musical taste and trends came along. You know, they were there before the new wave of British heavy metal. The first album is kind of punky, and then they changed their sound pretty quick. But Lemmy was already almost part of the old guard, so he didn't. The debate about whether they're part of the new wave of British heavy metal always goes on, but I think the reason they're not automatically in there is because Lemmy had already been around. And then they never sort of jumped on trends, hair metal or grunge or anything like that, but they were always there. And I think maybe they get taken for granted a little bit because they were just so consistent and always touring, always putting out albums. I think you can get into other things like them jumping record labels and never having maybe consistent support. That's an issue. Look at my notes here. Having a catalog that big too, I mean, other than I would say Overkill and Ace of Spades, you really don't have a clear consensus on what is great about the catalog. And that sometimes can prevent a band from reaching the next level. I literally was looking some of this up the other day, and a site like Louder Sound had Rock and Roll, the album Rock and Roll, rated dead last. And Ultimate Classic Rock had it 8th. And when you have 22 studio
Keep talking, I'm just going to show pictures because I took this stuff out. So,
all right, great. So when you have a catalog that big and the swing of what people consider great and not great, it's hard to get behind a band uniformly, I guess. There's other things like, you know, I think Lemmy is only going to appeal to a certain amount of people with his voice too. That's never going to make. I can't think of another band where a singer like Lemmy that you know, has platinum selling albums per se. Yeah, I mean, it's just but I love the band, extremely consistent. I think that's the part I love about them. Really never really put out a terrible album, maybe other than I'm not a fan of March or Die, but all the others I can get great enjoyment out of. So I think they're like, I'll go back to the beginning. I think they are talked about quite highly in our circles, but there's a lot of reasons why they never went past that super cult band status.
Right. Well, I always say you have to carve a little square out for our community, right? Because we are very much in the minority of music listeners. If you're watching this video or participating in this panel, you are not a normal music fan. You can just accept that as given. All right, let's go down to Parish of Rock. Parish, this is the first video I've hosted you've been on, so welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here. Well, a bit like the others, really, I also questioned the question about are they talked about. So I actually had a look at the Contrarians, and actually, to be fair, the Contrarians don't talk about Motörhead very often, at least not within the shows. So Rush is the most talked about. Kiss is the second most talked about. And in that regard, I'm talking about where there's specific shows about those bands, not whether they're talked about within a general show. Iron Maiden, Judas Priest was kind of the next level down. And then towards the bottom, you had Thin Lizzy, which surprised me, UFO. But Motörhead was pretty much at the bottom of bands spoken about or had shows on Contrarians. So in that regard, the question is actually quite apt, I think. So I then looked and had to think about why that might be and why generally we don't talk about them. And a bit like you, I've come up with 3 reasons. The first, like everybody else said, is kind of where do you start with all the number of albums, the number of, they've had 10 members, which is quite a lot for what's essentially a trio, but they've still had 10 members, so that's quite different. So from my point of view, I thought I'd kind of answer some of these questions myself. So where do you start? Well, I thought I'd start, for me, it started with that single, No Class. That's my entry point onto Motörhead. So that would have been, I think, 78. It was the Overkill album. It's the second single from the Overkill album. And from there, I went backwards and got singles. So I'm pleased to have the Motörhead original single on Big Beat. This is not the actual very original release. This was a re-release a couple of years later. On nice white. I'm a sucker for coloured vinyl for some reason. And then I got into the albums themselves. So I've got all of the albums pretty much. And like Kevin said, I don't think there's a bad album amongst them. But I have to say, for me, those first few albums, probably up to Orgasmatron is the run of albums I really like. I think after that, it's a bit more hit and miss. But I certainly think that first 7 or 8 albums is really good. So that's the first reason I think people don't talk about Motörhead so much. The second reason is I think it's hard to actually classify them. I know, Martin, you've had this debate. Are they a heavy metal band? Aren't they a heavy metal band? And whilst there's no doubt they've influenced a lot of genres like speed metal and thrash, etc., where do you actually put them? And if you're doing a kind of a show talking about certain genres of music, where would you include Motörhead or wouldn't you? I mean, they've got fans that are punk, and I guess that's where I kind of came into them almost, is because at the time I was into punk and new wave.
Harris, just to put a little bit of a finer point on that, we're going to do a show based on We Are Motörhead, and we play rock and roll. So
right, okay.
It's more of like, are they a heavy metal band versus what Lemmy thinks they are? That's
rock and roll.
The other thing is, are they a new wave of British heavy metal band, which gets to be a debate all the time. But I've never thought that they weren't a heavy metal band. They're squarely a heavy metal band. So anyways, I just want to throw that in.
No, okay. And so I thought about it, and for me, I mean, what I like about Motörhead is I think they're just really good songwriters. And more than anything, I think that's their strength. So whether you do put them as a heavy metal band or a rock and roll band or some other category, I think the songwriting is really good. And for me, they've got the best run of title tracks, I think, of any rock band. So you think from the first album of Motörhead through to Overkill, through to Bomber, through to Ace of Spades, through to Iron Fist, and you could just stop there, and that's probably the best run of most, if not all, heavy metal bands. Then you add you then add Another Perfect Day, which was, whilst that was never a single, I think that's also a great song. So you've actually got seven really good title tracks, and I think that to me is kind of one of the evidences of Motörhead being good songwriters. And just as an aside for a moment, an amusement thing, Ace of Spade is actually my wife and my song. That's our song. And when people ask me why, I say, well, it's a love song. So you think about it, you think of how it starts. If you want to gamble, baby, I'm your man, win some, lose some, it's all the same to me. I mean, you know, you can get a better love song than that, I think, from a set of lyrics. So, so I think the songwriting's really good. And I think actually that's overlooked sometimes when people talk about, you know, what genre do they sit within, and they overlook the quality. And I don't think, certainly here in the UK, I don't think it's a surprise that they've actually crossed over from the sort of the rock into mainstream with songs like Ace of Spades. I mean, you talk to almost anybody in the UK and they would know Motörhead, and they would certainly know Ace of Spades, and probably a couple of the other songs as well. So I won't say they're a pop band, but they've certainly done that crossover. And then the third reason, I started thinking about, okay, so that's in the context of these sort of shows why Motörhead's spoken about. But I then wondered, why aren't they not talked about down the pub? And I thought, or in the bar or whatever. And I thought, well, that's probably because to have a discussion, you need somebody who can talk and somebody who can listen. And most people have seen Motörhead, their hearing's beginning to go. So you can imagine two guys sat in a pub, and one guy would go, well, what's your favourite Motörhead song? And the other guy would go, pardon? What's your favourite Motörhead song? Sorry, what was that? Say that again. What was your, never mind, what would you like to drink? And so therefore the conversation never gets going because Motörhead fans are a bit like me, a bit hard of hearing. So those are my three reasons I think that perhaps they're not talked about as much as they should be. So there you go.
You know, I actually had the hearing loss thing in my own spiel, so we'll be hearing more about that later, maybe.
Yeah,
right.
maybe.
Why don't people talk about Motörhead?
Well, first, to jump on a couple points, Parish, I would actually stretch that title track greatness through at least Orgasmatron, which I think is one of the most different songs they ever did, and you know, that's like just molten, doomy, just a different kind of track for them. I love that song. And also, definitely as far as the volume goes, they had to be the loudest band I've ever seen.
Yeah, I agree.
I think I still have permanent hearing damage from seeing them open for Wasp. And I mean, it was loud beyond the. Usually a band is playing loudly and you could still like yell into your buddy's. It was so loud that you could be screaming in your buddy's ear and vice versa, and that you still couldn't hear anything over the din. So definitely probably the loudest band I've ever seen. I think Kevin made some good points. Parish too. Motörhead was never part of like a trend group. They've influenced so many different types of bands, but they never really got caught up in any one thing themselves. So it's kind of tough. They're like one of those bands that's kind of like out on an island by themselves in a lot of ways in terms of what they do. And I mean, they're bands that have definitely taken from them, but who else sounds exactly like Motörhead, except for maybe Midnight's White Spade project and Super Christ, but no one ever gets it exactly right, and they're just kind of like all over the map in terms of who they've influenced. They influence punk bands and thrash bands and regular metal bands, and I don't know. I also feel like, in a way, I wonder if Motörhead would be more. I wonder if Motörhead would have been in the same position, say, that a band like the Misfits is now. They disappeared for years. Glenn went on and did his thing. Those guys did stuff without him and stayed underground. And when those two sides came back together, like now they're playing arenas. Like they went from like, it's that the whole cult of the Misfits and the logo, and I just wonder if Motörhead had stopped at some point in the 80s. There are kids that love the shirt and the logo, that wear it, like whether I'm not one who goes up and says name 3 songs, but it's kind of the imagery kind of also I think outdistanced the band just a little bit at least in the United States. I mean, they were never big hit makers over here, no gold records. And I think them never making it to that next level here, hasn't been great in terms of them. People kind of, it's not that people don't remember them. I just think that past the 80s, they kept churning out respectable records, some of them better than others. I agree. I think I like all the records except for March or Die is not a particular favorite of mine as well. But for me, there's kind of a sameness. I don't know if it's in the production of those later records. And I think that comes back to, though, when you drop in with a band. I mean, I got in on Motörhead with No Remorse. And so I came in with the compilation record because I had heard Ace of Spades on a metal show, and that was the first thing I saw that was available at my local record store that I grabbed, and I played the shit out of that. So that's the material that always stuck with me. The first time I saw them was on the tour for Rock and Roll, opening for Overkill and Slayer. And I don't know, I've seen them a handful of times. I feel lucky to have been able to see them. I just feel like the people that came in early on Motörhead maybe kind of started dropping out after a while, and then I just don't think, as good as the newer material was, it ever really connected with people the way that Ace of Spades and Iron Fist and the Overkill record did, and the songs on Bomber, all that stuff on you can go down the track list of No Remorse. I mean, and including Killed by Death. But I just think that from then on, I don't know how many people can, be on true Motörhead nerds can name. I mean, part of it with me is as I get older, I find I can't really remember song titles as well. I'm like, oh, that's that song. And I just think that some of that stuff just didn't sit in as didn't become as ingrained as the older stuff did. Also, one of the points I think about Motörhead is that Motörhead, I think after a while, it kind of became more there was more of a cult of Lemmy than Motörhead, really. Lemmy became the icon. I mean, it was it's like when you go to Dublin, you're going to go to the Phil statue, the Phil Lynott statue. I mean, if you were out in LA, you were going to go to the Rainbow and try to find Lemmy at the One-Armed Bandit at the Rainbow. And I think him popping up in documentaries over the years, he was always quotable. The movie they made about it, I thought the movie was great. There's some good books out there about him and the band. But I think his imagery kind of, I think there's a whole, like I said, there's almost a whole cult of Lemmy as opposed to just Motörhead. Whereas I think the earlier bands, the original, the classic lineup of the band holds up better as a band than the later period, even though Phil was with him for years and Mickey played with him for years. I still think it was Motörhead and Lemmy were kind of synonymous, and the rest of the band was almost anonymous in a way, unlike the original, the classic lineup. I don't know. It's where I think they're one of my favorite bands since I first heard them. Like I said, glad to be able to see them live. I think they were making great music up until the end. The Aftershock album I thought was excellent. Bad Magic was good too, even though his voice, by that point, his voice was kind of pretty much shot. I mean, but there were good songs right up until the end. I do think it's a shame that they didn't have more success overall, but when you play that style of music, I mean, what can you really expect? It's a unique voice that isn't going to exactly light up radio dials, but they always said there was always a good sense of humor about them, and Lemmy was always an interesting character. The band wrote cool songs. There was a humor in the songs, and I just love their whole style. I mean, it really, as heavy as they are, and I consider them a metal band too, but they really are rock and roll. Yeah, so yeah, I don't know. It's I think they deserve more credit, and it's a shame that they're all, that classic lineup is dead, because now that they're gone, you won't see some of these bands like Motörhead or the Ramones, like we don't know, like at this point if they might have been able to cash in on being like elder statesmen at this point.
Hey, for the record, I thought I'd just check that this random pile of recent albums. So all of these have a title track: Sacrifice, Snakebite Love, March or Die, Rock and Roll, We Are Motörhead, and Overnight Sensation. And this little pile doesn't. Hammered, Inferno, Bastards, The World Is Yours, and Kiss of Death don't have a title track. So
right. They didn't do a song called Kiss of Death? That seems like such a Motörhead title.
I bet someone's going to point out that one or two of these showed up on a different album. But like you, Butch, I'm the same thing. It's like remembering the titles, and that's such the hard part about talking about these bands. You feel, if you played these albums, I would be humming along with every single riff, and I'd vaguely know, where the breaks are and what the lyrics are, but ask me to name them and tell you which ones are on which albums. Again, that sameness of production, the general high quality. I often say that this is one of the best examples of bands that in their elder years made some of their best music, kind of like a Steve Morse Deep Purple situation, right? Or King's X or Cheap Trick. Cheap Trick's equally frustrating as Motörhead. It's like, it's all good stuff. Like, what do you do, right? There's no bad albums in between. But I'll agree with you on March or Die. My least favorites would be March or Die, 1916 maybe Rock and Roll, and the debut. But other than that, I certainly will put those below all of that new stuff. So
okay. And this is why I love Contrarians, because I'm going to champion 1916 and March or Die. But we'll get around to that. This is the hard part about going last on these panels. One by one, you have all stolen most of my points, but it's okay. I'll come up with something. I think Butch is exactly correct. The cult of Lemmy is so much bigger than the cult of Motörhead. And because Motörhead were ubiquitous, they were everywhere. They never stopped. And they were always on opening acts in the States. Now, I know in Europe and internationally, they were still able to headline and they could do clubs and things in the US, but he could make more money as an opening act. So he's doing Ozfest and he's doing whatever Slipknot's festival was. I can't remember what it's called right now. But so Motörhead is everywhere, but not as a headliner, right? Motörhead was something that you got when you went to see somebody else. So you didn't have to be specifically looking for Motörhead to still get that Motörhead experience. And even though we joke about how loud Motörhead are, that was not a joke. That stupid band was way too loud. I remember being in this place called the Diamond Ballroom in Oklahoma City, which is a mid-sized theater. And I've told this story before, but literally they're playing and Lemmy looks over at Phil and says, "I can still hear them. Turn it up." And they did. And it was already painfully loud. And after that, everybody in the audience was going, "What is going on?" I don't understand that. That is just stupid because it's so loud. It takes away, even when you're a kid and not worried about your hearing, that takes away your ability to enjoy the music. And I do blame Motörhead for some low frequency hearing loss that I have. I had the privilege of standing side stage at a Motörhead show one time, paid for it, but still. And even side stage, it was so loud, although I'll never forget, Phil Campbell with his wall of Marshalls behind him, he was playing through a Marshall combo, a single speaker 12-inch Marshall combo on the side of the stage with a microphone in front of it. And that whole wall of Marshalls was just for show. I love rock and roll. So I think let's put some numbers on it. When we talk about Motörhead being a prolific band, now they existed in one form or another from 1975 until 2015 when Lemmy died. During that time, they put out 22 studio albums. 22 albums! By way of comparison, Iron Maiden just put out their 18th, and Judas Priest managed, I believe, Iron Maiden put out 17, and Judas Priest just put out their 18th album. So Motörhead put out a lot of albums. And there is this continual narrative that Motörhead all sound the same. There's certain bands get that narrative stuck on them. AC/DC, ZZ Top, Motörhead. People stick them with that. It all sounds the same tag. And at that point, once you hear one album, and everyone's going to get Ace of Spades, let's be honest about that. If a person is going to look up Motörhead the one and only time in their life, Ace of Spades is the album they're going to get. And then they're going to go, I don't have to listen to any more Motörhead because it all sounds the same. Now, that is a narrative that I do not agree with in any conceivable way. Even if you just look at the eras of Motörhead, so of course you have the Fast Eddie Clarke, Phil Taylor years had a sound. And then Fast Eddie leaves, and you have Phil Taylor and Brian Robertson, and they put out an astoundingly different album. My signed copy of Another Perfect Day. I love this album, but it is so unlike anything else that Motörhead ever did. It's just an outlier. Okay, then Robertson's out. You bring in Wurzel and Phil Campbell. And this version of the group gets two distinct eras, because you go up through No Remorse, you have Rock and Roll, you have Orgasmatron, and then during the recording, now I forget exactly when Phil leaves and then comes back, and they do what I think of as the Motörhead attempt to be commercial years. Now, several people have said Motörhead don't follow trends, and I think that's kind of not exactly correct. I think Lemmy was really unsuccessful at following trends, but I think there were several points where he tried. And 1916, March or Die, and Bastards are what I think of as their attempts to be commercial albums, right? He's co-writing songs for Ozzy Osbourne. He's putting songs on movie soundtracks. He's on the Hellraiser soundtrack. He's on that really terrible Brendan Fraser movie about the kids who take over a radio station. I don't even remember anymore, but they did Born to Raise Hell. Airheads, thank you. Born to Raise Hell was on that soundtrack. And those three albums are much more commercial sounding than anything else Motörhead ever did. Now, I happen to love those albums, and they have some songs that have never left the live set, like Going to Brazil, which is kind of Phil Campbell's signature song, really. And then they get to my personal favorite Motörhead album, which is Sacrifice. Wurzel leaves during the recording of Sacrifice. Nonetheless, they put out a phenomenal album, and they continue on as a three-piece. Now, if you want to say that the Phil Campbell years, the three-piece years with Mickey D and Phil Campbell and Lemmy are all of a piece, I can't argue with that, but I will say that on each album, you still get a lot of sonic diversity, right? They weren't just doing one song. They're doing boogies, they're doing straight-up rockers, they're doing heavy metal. So there's enough sonic interest, I think, for any fan to pick up an album. One of my late period favorites, Inferno. There's my signed copy of Inferno. And it's got a wide variety of songs, including the occasional dirge like Orgasmatron. That was the first one they did, right? Where it's just dad, dad, dad. Lemmy's not even really singing. He's just narrating over over that beat. And they would do that a couple of times. Now, the problem is you have to be a fan in the first place before you can understand anything about Motörhead on that level. If you're on the outside looking in, all you see are 22 albums that people have told you sound the same. So what are you going to do? You're going to pick Ace of Spades, and then you're probably never going to listen to another Motörhead album. And let's see here. Oh, and this is just a thought, but this is kind of dovetailing with things that now I'm losing track of who said what. But both Martin, I think, and Parish have mentioned this. Motörhead were simply freaking heavy. Martin has said before that they were the heaviest band in the 70s. I tend to agree with that. I think they have always been slightly out of step with the other bands that you might consider their peers. They were heavier than anybody in the new wave of British heavy metal. Rock and Roll and Orgasmatron were heavier than anything coming out of LA, like Motley Crue or Rat. You know, just when heavy metal was really starting to ascend in the United States, they might as well have been Pantera, right? I mean, they were heavy. Now, by the time you get to the 90s, obviously there are other bands, which makes it all the much weirder that 1916 was a commercial success. Nobody expected Motörhead to have commercial success in the early 90s, but they did with 2 albums. And then after that, their life as a commercial force was over, and once again, they just slid right off. But I think for just that brief period of time, they did try to follow trends. And then after that, Lemmy said, screw it, we're just going to do our thing. And luckily, his thing was something that people loved hearing. But if you saw Motörhead in concert, opening for Ozzy Osbourne, or opening for Metallica, or opening for who knows who on these big shows, probably a lot of people were not then compelled to go seek out their albums. They felt, hey, I've had the Motörhead experience. It all sounds the same, right?
Yeah. You know, one thing you mentioned is the sonic diversity. And I think sonic might be a word that might be a little bit off, because sonic, well, I was thinking of arrangements, right? So the interesting thing, I mean, they do have a variety in style on a lot of those albums, but you know, once you're a deep Motörhead fan, you can kind of tick those off and notice the 5 or 6 styles that they'll do on any given album, right? Yeah. But the interesting thing is that, as Butch says, the production helps cause it to sound samey, even though frustratingly for a fan, it's great production, but we still complain about it. It's a little bit like all of those Accept albums with Mark Tornillo. They all kind of sound great and they sound the same, and we complain, right? But the interesting thing in terms of, I guess there's a sameness of arrangement too, because you have a very distinct bass sound, you got a very distinct vocal sound, and the guitars are, you know, buzzsaw heavy metal guitars. The drums always sound great, but pretty much samey. And then there's not a lot of super variety in super loud, super quiet. I mean, it's basically, there's a uniformity there, but there's just a wealth of cool heavy metal riffs and styles and breaks and fills across those albums that make them just amazing. And Lemmy's lyrics are really, really good. Like, they're super interesting. That's something that people should talk about more.
Right. And I'll go to bat for Phil Campbell and say I think he's the best riff writer the band had. Some of the riffs on those late period albums are absolutely amazing. He has a song called Slow Dance. I think it's on We Are Motörhead. It's just slow and doomy and chuggy, and it starts off the beat, and then when the drums kick in, it pauses for like 1/16, and suddenly everything's on the beat. That's a very effective moment. I love Motörhead.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a lot of reasons why people might not be talking about Motörhead. Anybody want to throw in some general comments? Kevin, you have some follow-ups?
The only other thing I would say is it seemed like whenever the band had a little bit of momentum with a few successful albums, they would fall or stumble a little bit. You know, you can think, you know, I think Live at Hammersmith, it might be their best-selling album, if I'm not mistaken. And they follow that up with Iron Fist, which we look back on it now and we like Iron Fist, but at the time, I don't think it was received very well. And then, in the latter period, there was like you said, they got a little momentum with 1916 and then March or Die, which most people have near the bottom of their list, So it was
Philistines.
Yeah. Seems like every time they had a few albums that were going in a certain direction and were getting a following, then they would stumble and put out one that was, I'll say bad by Motörhead standards, but really there's no bad Motörhead album. So, that's the only other thought I had.
Okay, legitimate. Parent. Oh, go ahead, Butch.
I was just gonna say, I think I would agree with that. It's something I was thinking of while we were talking too. Is exactly what you said. Iron Fist has always been kind of written about as the band's kind of taking a step back writing wise. It wasn't that well received, and to compound that, they did Another Perfect Day, which is one of those records that, like Born Again, it kind of divides the fan base. There are those of us who love it, and some people hate it because it's a really commercial sounding, different sounding record. I mean, for me, like Shine is probably my favorite Motörhead song, but it's real, like kind of like, I don't want to use the word wimpy, but compared to some of the stuff that came before it, I mean, there's certainly stuff on that record that's kind of like definitely more commercial, but I mean, they came out of the, in terms of stumbling blocks, I mean, and that was the tour with Robertson was a disaster too. And so I think that's, that the band had to like rebuild after that again. I mean, which I think with No Remorse, they did. I mean, it got them back into, Killed by Death got some airplay on MTV. And I mean, you did see them again and, coming over the US more, or trying, opening in arenas for bands. And so, yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that point. Also, like they got on their labels that they got on after March or Die were smaller and smaller over the years. And I think it doesn't help a band like Motörhead when you're known as kind of having stuff that sounds kind of all the same. When I mean, we know that's not the case, but in an era when things are going more, the amount of music we're being exposed to is widening and widening and widening, and you don't listen to albums, as many times as you did. You might play something once or twice, and you don't play it enough times to find the little things about it that make it different. So I think that didn't help them at all either.
Okay, Parish?
Well, I mean, I think the reason that people say they all sound the same is they never went through a period of doing a different style of music. So they never had a disco phase or they never had a pop phase. So quite a lot of other bands, it feels as if they're more versatile because of the going off at a tangent and having a prog phase or whatever. But Motörhead just kind of had that same style and phase of music, if you like, all the way through. And I do wonder the fact that they did 22 albums. So that's an album every 2 years. So they kind of kept the routine that the 70s bands did, which was release an album, tour a bit, release an album, tour a bit, release an album, tour a bit. And I think Motörhead seemed to just keep going with that. And it's very hard to have a comeback album when it's only been 2 years since your last album. Some of the other bands, it might be 5 years, or they may have split up and then reformed, or they've gone away. So all of us, you think of Guns N' Roses, they went away. So when they come back, everybody's really excited. But Motörhead never went away, so they never had that comeback. And I think that might be part of it as well. A couple of other sort of random things, really. I was playing some songs earlier this afternoon, and I played Ace of Spades single. And then I put the Ace of Spades album on and forgot to switch it to 33 1/3. So just interesting. It obviously is a bit faster, but the thing that really jumps out is Lemmy sounds like Geddy Lee. So if you want to hear what Rush would sound like playing Motörhead, play Motörhead. Well, certainly one of the early albums at 45, and you get the vocal. So being a bit strange, I then thought, I wonder what the 45 sounds like if I slow it down and play a single at 33 and a third. Lemmy at 33 and a third created death metal vocals. That's what it sounds like. So totally random, but that's something slightly different. The other thing I was going to say is random, and this might be saying a bit too much about me, and this, I might be the only person in the world that does this, but when I get in the shower, I always take the shower head, put it up a bit, and sing Motörhead songs into it. So there you go. So I get my shower head, and it's up there, and I start singing Motörhead songs into it. Again, I might only be the only person who does that, but it works for me.
Okay, so that's why people aren't talking about Motörhead. They're literally drowning. So I wanted to throw out one other thing. If you go back to the early 80s, and my first, probably not the early 80s. I don't want to get my 80s timelines mixed up, but it's been a while, and my mind doesn't work like it used to. My first visuals of Motörhead were in these weird English media appearances. It wasn't like videos on MTV. It was watching them play Iron Fist on The Young Ones, right?
Yes.
Or
Ace of Spades,
Lemmy riding his motorcycle out of a grave. Wasn't he in the movie Eat the Rich? Some weird English black comedy that he does this appearance on. And I just don't think that Lemmy was particularly savvy at that time about managing his own image, right? So not like Ozzy, who had Sharon. Now Ozzy is a stumble bum who has stumbled into success because he's guided by somebody with clear vision making him go places. Whereas I don't think Lemmy ever had somebody to do that for him. And so there was never anybody to save Lemmy from himself.
Well, that might be why they're more well known over here, because there was certainly a period in the late 70s where they were frequently on top of the pops. And you imagine a show that's all about pop, the pop stars of the day, and then all of a sudden you have Motörhead on there, and that would have been sort of 20 million people would see that every Thursday night. So what you think may be a bit random for them, that might be why they're kind of a bit more in the subconscious over here, and people know about. I mean, this T-shirt. This may be the case over with you guys, but I got this T-shirt in the local supermarket. So it's you can just go and. So they have got that real sort of ingrained into the culture of the UK sort of. Now, how many people would actually know who they were? I don't know, but it's not usual that you can go into a local supermarket and get, certainly not where I live, and get a rock T-shirt. So,
and that makes it all the more ironic that Lemmy left and went to LA of all places. Yeah. All right, so as we do in these shows, I like to give Martin the last word. Martin, you got any last words for us?
Yeah, just a couple of quick things. So to clarify about calling the heaviest thing in the 70s, I've done, I think I did a one of my History in 5 Songs audio podcast episodes about the heaviest albums of the 70s. So yeah, I have argued that Overkill and Bomber, both 1979 albums, are the heaviest albums ever made in the 70s. And I also want to say that I always fall firmly on the side. For some reason on Facebook, if you start talking about, if I start saying Motörhead's part of the new wave of British heavy metal, they come out of the woodwork and start yelling at me, right? But I totally believe that. I know they had 3 albums in the 70s, but certainly when you think of the new wave of British heavy metal, they're literally either the second or the third band that comes to mind, Saxon and Maiden being the other ones, right? And they're in there with the colored vinyl and the singles and the non-LP tracks, and they're playing with all those bands. They got a logo, they got colored vinyl on bronze. My Bomber is blue, and my Overkill is what would that be? Red. But yeah, they were both colored, and and the look and the championing metal and all that. I mean, obviously the sound's a little different, but basically they are right in there like a dirty shirt, being literally one of the top 3 bands that are new wave British heavy metal. One last thing, I also did an episode about thinking some of these great old albums that probably are gold. And I did the numbers on Ace of Spades. Given the amount of plays of the song Ace of Spades, if whoever is looking after this went back, I'm pretty sure Ace of Spades is now a gold album. So you could go get that certified if you wanted to pay for it and get the audit done and do all that, given that the fracture and the members and the labels and the people being dead and all that makes it more unlikely. But I firmly believe, when I did the numbers, that Ace of Spades is a gold record in the States.
All right, there you go. That's fitting tribute, I think. So we'll end it there. Leave your comments below. Do you talk about Motörhead? Are you afraid to talk about Motörhead? Do your friends make fun of you if you talk about Motörhead? No, Motörhead's cool. Talk about them more. Watch more Contrarians videos. There is a ton of content up on YouTube. We'll be making more videos soon. Check out the Patreon if you're interested in that sort of thing. And go to your local supermarket and buy Motörhead shirts. We knew that was possible. All right, everyone. We'll see you next time.
All right. Thanks again, guys.
Bye.
Talk to you later.